and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this particular episode, we are very, very pleased to have a guest. And I do think you have an unfair advantage, Gareth, in terms of many of the people that you know typically have more interesting stories and more interesting backgrounds than I do. So I'm very happy to hand over to you. Would you like to talk a little bit about our guest today?
I'd be delighted. So I'm particularly excited about this week's episode. We're joined by Oliver Lee OBE, who I've mentioned before. So when we did the Frankenstein's monster episode on leadership and we built our own leader, I cheekily added Oliver as part of the mix there. My reasoning for that will hopefully become really apparent as we go through this episode. So Oliver is a former colonel in the Royal Marines. He's an internationally renowned leader, fascinated by people, trust, culture and performance. He has been the chief executive in the commercial, not-for-profit and public sectors. Each of these large organisations have faced acute challenges before and during Oliver's tenure. His approach of moral courage, ethical leadership and placing people first delivered winning cultures and unprecedented outcomes. For 6 years, he was chief executive of The Challenge, a fast-growing social enterprise competing with government outsourcing heavyweights. More recently, he has been the chief executive of Places Leisure and of the West Midlands Fire Service. On graduating from Cambridge, Oliver's first career was also hallmarked by leadership and people. He joined the Royal Marines, winning the Sword of Honour in training and leaving 18 years later as the youngest full colonel since World War II. He was decorated 3 times by the Queen for operational leadership in Afghanistan and Iraq. Oliver lives in Oxfordshire and is married with 2 teenage sons and enjoys travel, hill walking and following various sports. And I think for me, more importantly, it's Oliver's journey from his first career in the Royal Marines into his second career in the civilian world, which I think is particularly important. I first heard about Oliver when I was a very young junior officer in the Royal Marines, and Oliver was described as one of the officers that was going places. And as a lieutenant colonel at the time and commanding officer of a unit, he was already being talked about as a potential 3 or even 4-star officer in the Royal Marines, which is quite unusual. We're a very small organisation. And after 18 years, Oliver resigned his commission, and we'll get into the reasons behind that, but it had a lot to do with integrity and moral courage. And I think that's kind of the subject of this episode.
And I wonder as well, we'll do this later in the episode, whether it's, we often talk about the differences and similarities between the military and the civilian world, and that sort of to some degree is the premise of our podcast. But perhaps later we'll also talk to Oliver about what that looks like as well. I think Oliver, he's watching us as we're talking about this. You're incredibly well placed to sort of confirm or deny whether the lessons that you learn on the military side and the civilian side are interchangeable. But we've been extremely rude. Oliver, welcome to the podcast, and thank you very, very much for joining us and giving up some of your time.
Absolutely not at all. My pleasure to be here, and thanks for such a generous and kind introduction. I come at it with no preconceptions or preconceived ideas at all, so delighted to take the conversation in any of the directions you've suggested, or indeed others.
I think some of our listeners will know your background and some of the stories, case studies, if you like, of why you made the decisions you made.
Should we go back to the beginning, actually?
Yeah.
And we don't often do this. Maybe it sounds like a trivial question. Why did you join the Royal Marines, Oliver?
Actually, I think that's quite a good start point, Chris, and I'm delighted to talk through that. I've often wondered it myself. not least on the basis of all that flowed thereafter, good, bad, and indifferent. Of course, that focuses the mind to a point, and you retrospectively, I think, check and consider and think through the decision making that you did at X or Y or Z point in time. I think it's fair to say that I was an anorak about leadership from an extremely early age. I remember an occasion when I was probably 10. I was in the not most senior, but the second most senior class, so one off the final year at my small Church of England primary school in Birmingham, where I grew up. And the teaching staff made a decision which the pupils were all aghast with, which was that the games and sports we most loved and enjoyed playing at lunchtime in the playground of this little primary school, British Bulldogs, chain dig, etc., were all going to be banned because they were viewed, perhaps with retrospect fairly enough, although I didn't see it this way at the time, they were viewed as too dangerous. And we were all up in arms, and everybody was thoroughly fed up about this rather draconian decision that had been taken. And I decided to do something about it. And I persuaded the entirety of the sort of top 3 years of the school to conduct a sit out and to refuse to go back into school after lunch one day in order to protest against this outrageous rule that had been imposed upon us. And people followed. They did as I suggested. And of course, cue teachers getting increasingly cross, cue the headmaster ultimately comes out, and inevitably this rather weak protest started to dissipate, and sheepish children started to go back into school, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. But we'd sort of made our point a little bit, I suppose. The long and the short of that rather ridiculous story about me as a 10-year-old is that I was suspended from school. That was, I think, perfectly reasonable. My behaviour had been poor, and my parents made that entirely clear to me on my unexpectedly arriving home for a week. But on returning to school, the very progressive and interesting headmaster, a man called Doug Sweet, Mr. Sweet, as we of course all knew him, got me into his office and said, you've taken your punishment. What you did was extremely silly, and I deeply disapprove of it. And I know that your parents do likewise. But I have reconsidered, and we are going to allow some of these games to be played at lunchtime. And I found myself absolutely elated. I had no idea at all at the time that that was kind of quasi 10-year-old leadership, but it excited and attracted me greatly as a concept. It was a version of doing the right thing viewed through a 10-year-old's eyes, and in many ways it was actually the wrong thing, but it felt right at the time, and therefore I found it exciting and invigorating. And really from that sort of small seed then grew a very strong desire in me. Partly I was the oldest of 6 children born in 8 years. I imagine that had an impression upon me. I greatly enjoyed sport and the leadership of sport whilst at school. I was fortunate enough then to win a place at Cambridge University, and I enjoyed kind of similar things there. And although I had some commitment to the Royal Marines on the basis of the fact that it had sponsored me through Cambridge, I rather stoically refused to be handcuffed by that. And so I was prepared, if necessary, to work out a way whereby I didn't have to fulfill that and I could buy my way out of it or whatever. I was determined that I was going to look at the job opportunities on offer at the end of a Cambridge degree in an open sense, and that I wouldn't just dutifully troop off to the Royal Marines. And I looked at them, and just none of them appealed remotely in the same way. They didn't excite or attract my attention in the way that the Royal Marines did. And I think if I was to put it into a nutshell now, I would say I don't think I could have expressed this articulately or adequately at the time. But I think I would say that I'd made the decision that I wanted to lead in the most demanding circumstances that were available. And that to me was more important than various of the other things that were potentially on offer at the end of Jesus College, Cambridge, job search, milk round. And so I fulfilled my obligations and I didn't apply for anything else. And I made my way straight into the Royal Marines on completing university. And the rest is history. But I think that probably gives you a sense of the background, Chris.
I don't know whether you could see me slightly smiling, but I have a 17-year-old son who's going through a similar thing where he is also thinking about a career in the Royal Marines. And so it's very interesting to sort of go and
Lovely.
Well, it's interesting to question him about his reasoning for it as well. I wanted to just test you talked about leadership. Was there an element of testing yourself there as well? Or was that something that was almost assumed?
No, there were an array of reasons. I think leadership and people certainly lay at the heart of them. I think that is undoubted. But there were many other reasons. I wanted to do something that was challenging. I wanted to do something that was going to put myself under real pressure and that I would learn things about myself. I'd read geography. I was extremely interested in the world, and travel appealed greatly. And I think in simple terms, I didn't think I was hugely well suited to what I would describe as the jobs that the vast majority, which I respect greatly, incidentally, but the vast majority of my friends left university to go and do and have been enormously successful in and continue to do today. But management consultancy or accountancy or merchant banking and so on and so forth just didn't feel quite right for me by way of fit. And those people they're some of my best friends. I've been best man to a number of them over the years, and they have been my best man, or one of them has been my best man. So there's absolutely no criticism implied at all. It just didn't feel quite right for me. So there were a number of factors at play that led me to that decision. But I think, Chris, probably leadership and people lay at the heart.
I'm pleased to know there are other, if you'll excuse the phrase, nerds like us who kind of lie awake at night thinking about these things. I often used to think I was a bit odd because I thought about this, but
Well, I mean, you are a bit odd.
okay, I'll accept that. But at least I seem to be in reasonably good company in doing that. Well, perhaps you could give a sort of canter through your career as you've joined the Royal Marines. How did that turn out for you? Did you find what you were looking for in that respect?
That's a special thing to ask me, and something that I've again thought about a lot. And I hope I can explain this without it sounding arrogant, which is a trait that I deeply dislike, or hubristic. And I think I could probably get away with that on the basis of the fact that some years later I made the rather fateful decision to leave in a reasonably well-known set of circumstances. I resigned from the organisation. So I'll simply answer your question truthfully. It was perfect. I felt like I was fitting almost a kind of hand into a glove that was designed for me, and I was designed for it, and it felt everything that I had hoped it possibly would be, and actually considerably more. It provided the leadership, the people, the excitement, the challenge, the variety, the dynamism, all of the things I was hoping for. But I also, worked out that actually I was modestly quite good at this, and it suited me well. And so, young officer training, which I think is a nightmare for many people, and I respect that greatly. I watched people finding it a nightmare. Just wasn't for me. I found it everything I wanted to be doing, and I found it to be challenging but entirely surmountable. And I didn't find any element of it kind of unable to be done, and I was very successful at the end of it, which allowed me to sort of start to define my career, because I'd won the Commando Medal and the Sword of Honour, which were the two kind of prizes on offer, and that allowed me to select. This is a tradition in the Royal Marines, where I would go to after young officer training, and I went to 4-2 Commando. I had a wonderfully happy year there, which taught me one thing that perhaps training entirely hadn't, or hadn't fully, is what I'm trying to say, which is that it's not about you, it's about the men. And I don't mean that in a way that ignores gender. It's simply that the Royal Marines contained only men in those days, and pretty much sadly still does. But I think some of that is changing. But I learned in that year in 4-2 Commando that the men come first, and they are by far and away the most important asset, and you need to lead in a fashion that is selfless towards them, whereby they are more important than you are. And that was and I became very close friends with them. In fact, I have an exchange which I'm very proud of once a year with one of the Marines who was in the troop I commanded in 4-2 Commando, a man called Jules Catamol, Marine Catamol as he was then. And we always have an exchange in the new year just to catch up. We're talking now pretty much 30 years later. And I actually sent my response to him literally yesterday, because there are a lot of Geordie fans in this household, and so football dominated yesterday. And so whilst the football was on in the background, I sent my annual update to Jules. And it kind of illustrates how much the importance of the men and the people that you're privileged to lead resonated with me during that period of time, because although there is a little bit of that in training, there isn't all that much of it, and I found training in relative terms quite straightforward. The big learning for me was that as the leader, you come second. And then really the career went from there. It focused on two things principally. One was operational leadership, initially in Northern Ireland and Bosnia in a reasonably modest way, and then post 9/11 in quite a significant way, with some quite significant happenings in Iraq, and then heavily for a long period of time working on Afghanistan, either in Afghanistan or back in the UK. And the second element was working at the strategic level in Whitehall in London, firstly on the personal staff of the Chief of Defence Staff, Lord Boyce, later a very, very close friend of mine, I gave a tribute to him in his memorial service in Westminster Abbey 18 months or so ago. And it's an interesting story, because he was 30 years older than me and 8 ranks above me when I worked for him, and we became ferociously close friends. And it was a remarkable thing that he never told me in his life, that in the wishes that he left after his sad death, he wanted me to speak at this service, which was a quite extraordinary thing to realise. And then later on, working for defence ministers, similarly in a personal capacity, specifically the Minister for the Armed Forces and the Secretary of State for Defence, at the kind of high water mark of all that was going on in Afghanistan. So those were really the hallmarks of the career. And along the way, I loved it, and I succeeded at the 2 levels of Staff College. Lots of things came my way, perhaps unreasonably easily, promotions, selections for the most sought after jobs, and so on and so forth. And so we jumped in with both feet as a family. My wife, who I met because she was an army officer and we were on a course together, we'd worked out that we couldn't really hang it together if we wanted to have children with us both serving. So she very generously left, and we adopted the married quarter approach, where we moved around with my jobs and we committed wholeheartedly to them. And our intention was to send the children away on the military education allowance so that they had some continuity of education and so on and so forth. So we were loving it, and we were absolutely all in as a family.
Thank you. Actually, that's such an interesting sort of compressed view of that career to date. I wanted to go back, if it's okay. You mentioned something almost casually On the other hand, I could see how much you meant it, which was, as a leader, you come second and your men come first. People who've listened to our podcast will hear us say similar things. And of course, there are other leaders who've said that. But I can imagine, in fact, I know I have met people who glibly acknowledge the statement and yet secretly believe it's not about the men or the women. It is about the genius of your own leadership. And actually, that's what really matters. Can you just go one level a little bit deeper? Clearly, that means a lot to you. And I think it's going to be a really interesting segue as we talk a bit more about integrity as well. But I'm going to always say, convince me that that isn't just something from a leadership book, that the leaders come second and the men come first. Why have you come to that position?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a very reasonable challenge, and also an interesting challenge. And it's one that one could easily answer in a way that is showy or immodest. And those are not traits that I enjoy or seek, if I can possibly avoid it, to demonstrate myself. So I will try and avoid them. How to answer the question? I think your broad proposition is right. I think that a lot of people, and I don't think it actually matters whether you're in a military or a civilian context here, incidentally. I think it applies both ways. I think a lot of people lay claim to a certain brand of leadership that in reality they don't actually deliver on. That's a fact in my view. Some might disagree, and I would respect that. So I respect all outlooks and viewpoints and opinions, but in my personal view, that is a fact. And I believe, again, my personal view, that I have seen that on many, many occasions, both in the military and indeed in the now more than 12 years since. What's the answer, though, to the question? And I'm not trying to duck it. What's the answer to the question head on? I think it's a personal belief system, and you either believe it and truly go for it, or you don't. Somebody wrote to me, which was read out at my leaving event from the Royal Marines, and this is perhaps the simplest way of explaining it. My two RSMs, when I was commanding 4-5 Commando, both exceptionally close friends of mine, godparents to my children, wildly different backgrounds from my own, far more challenging backgrounds than my somewhat gilded one. They both spoke, and they interspersed what they said with a few things that had been written to them about me that they could then read out. And one of them came from somebody who simply said, I think it was kind of words to the effect of, the thing that puts you ahead of the pack is that you truly, truly care for the men. Others stare at their feet and wait for the next promotion. You don't. And I think that's kind of how I viewed it. And I think if I'm going to slightly knock this nail below the wood, I think I proved it, in that I had an enormous inflection point as this rather grand youngest full colonel since the Second World War, with my family all in, with never having had a CV in my life, with absolutely no comprehension of what I would do if I was not any longer in the Royal Marines, and with no background money behind me to look after my family or educate my children or whatever it might be. And on the basis of the fact that something outrageous happened to a man who at that point in time was beneath my command, although pretty tenuously so, I took the view that I had to resign, because I took the view that that was a fundamental breakdown of what I would describe as sacrosanct relationship between command and commanded. Part of the reason my career had been successful is that, and again, I use the word advisedly, the men trusted that I was authentic when I said that they came first. And I made this completely clear to them, incidentally. I would tell them this, and I would ask them to challenge me if they felt I was falling short. So I wasn't covert about it at all. I was entirely overt about it, as I was with the families, as I was with the bereaved, as I was with the wounded. And I was never, ever challenged, because I I think I fulfilled on the pledge that I consistently made. And I therefore think it would have been very hard to challenge me as such. And so I found myself on this extraordinarily difficult weekend where I had this monumentally big decision to make, finding the decision extremely straightforward. I found the implications surrounding the decision horrendous. Where are we going to live? Where are the children going to go to school? Where's the money going to come from? How am I going to feel? Will I ever feel this level of specialness or fulfillment surrounding my career again? I was expecting another 20 years. What on earth am I going to do for that period of time versus everything that I'd been anticipating? Now, essentially, my whole kind of belief system in the workplace was in the process of being dismantled. So the onerousness of the implications of the decision was vast, but the decision was utterly straightforward. I had a glass of wine with my wife and realised that if I didn't make this decision, I would no longer be able to look myself in the mirror. And all that I had claimed to be for the previous 18 years would be fraudulent. And I knew that I couldn't possibly do that. So it was a case of take the pain rather than selling your soul. And somebody rang me up during that period of time, very senior person, because I came under quite a lot of pressure because I went from being the kind of golden child to the black sheep pretty much overnight. And somebody rang me up and said, Oliver, you should be aware you're throwing away a knighthood here. And I thought, you absolutely don't get it. You absolutely don't get it.
We've had various conversations over the many podcasts we've had, and I'm going to say something, and please don't take offense because it could sound offensive to start with, but you've talked about principles of leadership as sacrosanct, and which clearly whether we live up to those, I don't know, but we 100% believe in. But
well, no one lives up to them perfectly.
I think you've done quite well, but we'll come on to that later. But the point I wanted to make was you almost going back to this point about putting yourself second and the men first. I think there is a risk that when we read that, it is almost romantic, and people think romantic fool. And actually, the bit that I wanted to get to, and I'd love to get your sort of thought on this, because this must have crossed your mind. I think the reason why you put the men first is for two reasons. The first reason is because they are the people that you serve, and that is a fundamental part of the theory of leadership. I meet so many people who say, yes, but pragmatically. And the second piece is, if you don't, you will never be successful, because it is the people that follow you. If they are not there, if they are not following you, if they are not carrying the guns into battle, you will not be successful. So this isn't some kind of romantic sense of leadership. If you look at it through a different lens, it is literally the most practical sense of leadership. If you expect people to follow you, this is literally the only way to do it. You have to get them to a point where they trust you. Otherwise, you will never make a successful partnership of leaders and followers. I don't know how you feel about that, because I don't like this idea that there is a sense of romanticism about good leadership. And whenever you see it in a film or you see it in a book, it's great people doing wonderful things and they fail at the end, but they failed for good and honest reasons. No, you are doing this because you are in command, a 4-5 commando, and to make that an effective military unit, that was a critical part of it, that the people who made up your unit trusted you implicitly and followed you. And so, I don't know, what's your sense of this, of sort of the romantic versus the brutally practical?
I don't find that offensive at all. I think it's an incredibly interesting line of inquiry. And actually, I overwhelmingly agree with what you've just said, Chris. I don't think this is a romantic ideal. Not at all. I never have. I think there are two elements to it, and you've had a good go, in my opinion, humbly, of unpacking both of those. I think the first is that there has to be a recognition that if you carry responsibility for other human beings, the corollary of that is that you recognize it is a very, very serious privilege. and it is something that you carry. You seek to carry it apparently lightly, of course. That wonderful quote about why angels fly, not because they've got wings, but because they carry themselves lightly. Of course you do that, but you shoulder the onerousness of it completely, because you have this extraordinary responsibility that is bestowed upon you. And I don't think that's romantic. I think that's a matter of fact. I don't think that's boy's own. If you read what Slim achieved with the Forgotten Army in Burma, he profoundly adored his people, but not in a romantic way, not in a naive way. He just felt an acute sense of responsibility for them. And to unpack that, and I'll come to your performance point in a moment, to unpack that, the 4-5 Commando Padre in Chaplin in Afghanistan, wonderful man called Scott Shackleton, who I was absolutely thrilled was decorated with a Queen's Commendation at the end of the tour. He held no rank, because there is a delightful Royal Marine tradition that the chaplain is viewed as carrying the same rank as whomever he is speaking to at that moment in time. So 1 minute a Marine, the next minute a general. So he has no hierarchical power over anybody. He also, of course, has to adhere to the Geneva Conventions, and so can't carry any form of weapon, and consequently is a liability every time you take him out on the ground, which I did every day. And yet that commando unit would have gone to the end of the world for him. Why? Because they rightly believed to a man, and actually we had a small handful of brilliant women in Afghanistan, so who were attached to us for specialist reasons, to a man and a woman, they could sense, not religiously, but spiritually, his profound care for them, and therefore they would follow him, irrespective of those shortcomings in terms of hierarchical rank or carrying a weapon or whatever that he had. But I don't think that's romantic. I think that's human and real, and I think it's inspiring, and I think it's why people follow. The second point, and I don't know which one you put first, and it doesn't hugely matter. There isn't a chicken and egg issue here. The second point is people simply will not perform unless they are made to feel like that. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. I made a decision when I was horrified when I took over a really happy job early in my career, commanding a training team that was taking new entry Royal Marine recruits through training. And I was horrified by what I encountered, which was that the training team's approach, not my training team, all of the training teams, the way it was wired, the DNA, was that you shout from the sidelines rather than leading from the front these people through training who are petrified rabbits in the headlights. And when they get to a commando unit, of course, will be the most junior person there and will be led by anybody from a lance corporal upwards. So it seemed to me wholly bizarre that they would lead themselves through training. Clearly, they needed to be led, just as they were going to be in a commando unit. And so I made it completely clear there would be no team tents, there would be no bacon sandwiches for the training team. We would do everything that the recruits did, to include all of the commando tests with all of the weight. And that was quite shocking for people. Oh, goodness me, Corporal X or Sergeant Y, I'm actually going to have to do the Tarzan Assault course, and I'll be doing it with the recruits on their commando test day, and it won't look particularly clever if I can't do it. And so there was great resistance to this. And my recruit troop training team, who I managed to persuade would do this, and they did it absolutely brilliantly. For a period of time in the main dining hall in the Commando Training Centre, other training teams wouldn't sit with them to eat. So strongly did they feel that this was a threat and a risk to them. Because, of course, leading like that makes you vulnerable. But what leading like that does is mean the training percentage of success suddenly goes through the roof. And so you're delivering on the mission. And that came about I believe, because the training team that I was leading genuinely believed the more romantic notions that you touched on, Chris, and was therefore prepared to perform in that particular way. And that's now, I'm very proud of it, that's now viewed as, that is the basic expectation of taking a recruit troop through training at the Commando Training Centre, and indeed so it should be. The second example I'd give you is, when I took command of 4-5 Commando, I knew that 18 months later, it had just come back from Sangin, the most challenging bit of Helmand. It was deeply damaged. 12 men dead, 80 men wounded, walking around the commando unit, or often in wheelchairs moving around the commando unit. So I would see these people every day. And some serious mental scar tissue flowing from that extraordinarily distinguished but challenging tour in 2008-9. And then I took the unit over just as it came back from post-operational tour leave in summer 2009. And we were going back in 2011. And I knew that we weren't going back to Sangin, because by that point it was going to be the Americans in Sangin. So I knew we needed to reset, and we needed to work out how to do this differently. And I had long taken the view that we were operating in Afghanistan. We, the coalition forces, were operating in Afghanistan in a way that was counterintuitive and also counterproductive. We were involved in just way too much violence out there, and almost all of the violence lay in the interests of the insurgency. So inadvertently, we were helping the insurgency the whole time. And the trick to making the insurgency irrelevant was to stop the violence rather than to participate in it. There are occasions with the most irreconcilable zealots where some violence might be justified, but in the main it wasn't. And all it did was dissuade the terrific, beautiful, ordinary Afghan people from playing any part in defining their futures, because they chose a survival strategy based on anonymity. Keep your head down and you might just get through this. And there are multiple other reasons to do with the way Afghanistan is structured culturally, that the way we were approaching it just wasn't right. And so I was very clear that I wanted it to be done extremely differently, but I wasn't clear how to make that happen. So I knew the what, but I didn't know the how, because Royal Marines are thrill seekers. And they've been trained in offensive spirit in recruit or officer training. And many hadn't been to Afghanistan before, and so weren't sure what to be careful of wishing for. And most aren't afraid of a punch-up. And most are quite keen to accrue some stories that they might tell to some grandchildren in their rocking chair in decades to come. So it was a huge cultural change programme. And the way I did that was that I delegated the production of the plan to more than 1,000 people. And normally the plan would be produced by 5, 6, 7, 8 people, the commando planning group at commando level, the company planning group at company level, the brigade planning group at brigade level, and some people all looking a bit like me, and with backgrounds a bit like me, would come up with a plan, and then from on high would impose that plan on their people, be that 50, 500 or 5,000, it doesn't matter. And I didn't think that would work, because I didn't think there would be genuine buy-in. I thought the only way to obtain genuine buy-in was that if everybody felt that they were sufficient, the romantic point, that they were sufficiently cared for, that they had a genuine voice in the production of this plan. I delegated the production of the plan within some sensible parameters and boundaries. That's the art of delegation. It's not anarchy. But I said, I will listen to everything. And the most extraordinary ideas came from the most extraordinary places. Civilian storemen in Royal Marines Condor, where 4-5 Commando is based, who had never been to Afghanistan and would never go there. And they'd say, well, have you thought about this? Or have you thought about that? And at the weekends, I still fretted that I possibly wasn't getting the full picture, and that I wasn't being told the whole truth, because you're very powerful as a commanding officer. You can send people to prison. You have a huge influence over their future careers, all of which petrified me that I was hearing a version of events that people wanted me to hear rather than the truth. And it was about unlocking 1,500 brains, not just my own, to come up with a plan that genuinely would work, which remarkably it did. And I had a house in the middle of 4-5 Commando that was trapped in the middle and therefore had never been sold. It was a beautiful merchant's house from centuries before. And in the Second World War, 4-5 Commando had been constructed around it. That's where my family and I lived. And around our house was the men's accommodation, the accommodation blocks, 8-man blocks, or 8-man dormitories within larger blocks. And I would just sit in the garden at the weekend and listen to where the biggest party was kicking off, which I loved. And it was an electric place, and it was a happy place. And sometimes I'd go to that party, shorts, T-shirt, flip-flops, couple of beers on my own, people going, you can't do this. You need an entourage. You're going to lose an eyebrow. I thought, that's not going to happen. There's way too much respect around here. And that is when I got the most honest views. Shorts and T-shirt, no rank, no grandness marching somebody into my office, me in their house, me asking if I could come in, me taking a couple of beers and saying, what do you think, lads? Do you think we're on track? Do you think we're missing anything? Any thoughts you haven't been able to feed in? And I think that's the corollary of the romantic notion, that it unlocks your ability to do that. And what that led to was an 86% reduction in violence on our tour. These are all unprecedented outcomes, 0 collateral damage, 0 civilian casualties, and every one of 1,500 people came home alive. And I don't believe I did that. I believe I did that because I found a way of unlocking the brain and the commitment and the buy-in of everybody to do that. So for me, Chris, it's about service to the people you lead, in part because that's right and proper, but also in part because that unlocks their full capability and nothing else does.
That incredibly eloquent answer, and thank you. And it's this idea that I worry that people think that the benefits of great leadership are more romantic rather than practical, and you've summarised both. We could talk for hours about this, and I know Gareth's going to cast an army saying we should move on and talk about other things. But you talked about one thing which I grapple with on a day-to-day in my own career, and that is you talked about vulnerability. The traditional model is that the leader says, I understand the problem, I understand the mission, I understand the best way to solve it, this is what we're going to do. And that model can work very, very well, and of course it's the traditional one. And you talked about a different model where you said 1,500 people, many of which no one would ever have considered asking, I am going to ask you how we solve this problem. Now the challenge there, that's an incredibly, you have to be vulnerable to do that. Did you ever have a moment where you wondered, am I doing this the wrong way? Because my own experience is I am expected to be the one that comes up with the answers. And therefore, sometimes, although I know it's the right thing to do, the further I get into it, the more I'm nervous. Actually, am I doing this wrong? Am I abrogating my responsibility as a leader? Now, clearly the answer is you did the right thing, but how did you feel when you did that? Did you ever have any moments where you said, hang on a minute, we're discussing the idea from a civilian storeman in Condor. What are we doing? How did you manage that? I'm not going to suggest you had a crisis of confidence in it, but there must have been moments when you questioned, am I doing the leading, or am I instead letting the group lead me?
Yeah, so again, and I'm not saying this to shower your questions with praise. We didn't align on any of this prior to the podcast, and it's a welcome from my perspective anyway, really dynamic conversation. But that is another, in my view, excellent question, and I think there is a balance to be struck. I think I'll go back to what I said a few minutes ago, which is that I knew what the what was. I knew absolutely what I wanted to be done here. but I wanted everybody to work out how we were going to do that, because I thought that was the only way they would buy in. So there were pretty clear rails within which this was done. And, at one point during those rails, I sent 8 men, including one who was known as one of my very, very oldest friends, to Colchester for 2 months. So I don't think anybody had any doubt that I was prepared to shoulder my leadership responsibilities. In fact, I think they were extremely clear on that. But I think they felt that they had the space and the respect and the safety and the agency to make a proper contribution. But I don't think there was any doubt who the boss was. And I think if that doesn't sound grand, because I didn't hugely like that particular title, but it was the title that was routinely used, I think it was important that that was clear, because ultimately when you arrive in Afghanistan and things start to happen, you have to shoulder those responsibilities, and you have to shoulder them absolutely. Absolutely. So to give you a small example of that, in Afghanistan, I was an absolute stickler for standards. Why? Simply because I thought they would keep people alive. And I didn't like how powerful I was in certain respects. I didn't really like the kind of almost abrasiveness with which I'd seen that power carried by others previously. But it was a summer tour, it was searingly hot, and it was extremely tempting to cut a corner in terms of whether or not you wore all of the personal protection equipment, because it was all heavy and it just made the heat worse and it made it all more tiring. And so you might just go on a patrol not wearing the combat nappy that was designed to protect your genitalia if you suffered an explosion. And if ever I saw or heard of that happening, I immediately flicked into formal mode, and that person came to see me and they were fined. I loved the guys, and they felt genuinely, this is a romantic statement, I accept, but they felt like children to me, and to some extent still do. And I'm very close with very, very many of them still. And they were not paid anywhere near enough money, in my own personal, non-political opinion. And I took £30,000 off them on that tour, because I thought that if I didn't do that, the moment I turned a blind eye, the moment I failed to carry my full responsibilities as the leader, the rot would set in and something bad would go wrong. Similarly, I sent home 5 senior people during that tour with profoundly negative implications for their careers, because I just felt they weren't quite getting it right. So I think you do have to continue to stand up and be the leader, but I don't think that prevents you from enfranchising everybody in producing the best possible outcome. I might just touch briefly also on vulnerability. It's in a broader sense. It's a very good question. It's a very interesting thing to consider. My personal view, there are those who would disagree with me, and I would respect that. I don't think you can lead in demanding circumstances without people understanding that you are at least to some extent vulnerable. I just don't think it works. It's sort of AI, it's a robot. I just don't think it's not real, it's not human. And so lots of people have seen me cry. Lots of people have seen me down or up. People have seen me angry. People have seen me upset. And I don't actually have a problem with that. It means I hope they haven't seen those things, every 5 minutes, and I've been kind of, completely inconsistent as a leader. I'm not suggesting that at all. But I am suggesting that when 12 men get killed flying into Iraq, when I was the operations officer, it is not unreasonable that people around you realise that you are extraordinarily sad about that, even though you are at the same time trying to formulate the plan that will get everybody through it. I think otherwise you don't seem human. And so I don't think vulnerability is, and everybody knows that my brother in 2003 committed suicide, and it's a profoundly important thing to me. I don't hide that from anybody. It's an immense point of vulnerability for me. And on the 21st of January each year, I feel a bit blue because it's the anniversary of Adrian's death. And people who work for me, I tell that because it's me. It's part of me. And if they're going to follow me, they need to know me, just as if I'm going to lead them, I need to know them. So I don't think vulnerability is something to be scared of.
Oliver, we've talked quite a lot so far about the sort of romanticism of leadership, and we've tried to untangle that and actually look at the practical aspects of leadership. Of course, you and I have talked about this before, and Chris and I have mentioned it on the podcast several times. Perhaps the thing that we're not talking about, which is the other side of leadership, is the organisational culture of the organisation that you lead. Edgar Schein, the prominent sort of academic on organisational culture, describes these two things as two sides of the same coin. I think what you've described so far is building cultures that are effective. You talked about the end of your career in the Royal Marines without really talking about the specifics of it. Of course, you were referring to the incident of Sgt Al Blackman shooting an injured Talib and then the subsequent investigation. We're not going to relitigate that or really discuss what happened in that incident. I think more important is the organisational culture's response to that, and perhaps the organisational cultures that created conditions that perhaps enabled or exacerbated those behaviours. And then your response to that was to resign from the Royal Marines. We often talk about leadership being easy when everything's going well, and it's when things go badly or don't go to plan that actually leadership becomes incredibly difficult. Perhaps you could elaborate on the decisions that you took and the organisational culture that created those conditions that led to that decision.
Yes, I can, of course. I think that, I'd start off by saying, for all the reasons that we've already discussed, and not to avoid the question, I'll come to the heart of the question, of course. But I think for all the reasons that we've already discussed, leadership has to be applicable in fair weather or foul. You can't pick and choose. And if you pick and choose, you completely undermine, to use a civilian phrase, you undermine the brand of that leadership, because you've claimed to be one thing and in reality you are proven to be something else when the going gets tough. And that fails the authenticity test dramatically and can't possibly happen. So the more romantic element of it, the obligation that you have to your people and the desire for performance from those people, the kind of dual purpose of it all that we were talking about, particularly with Chris recently, I think has to apply in all weathers. I also think your point about two sides of the same coin is largely right, and I know that academic body of work. I mainly agree with it, but I think one has to have one's eyes open to the fact that there are moments when those two sides of the coin misalign and become different coins. If you've got two sides of a 10p piece, that's fine. If you've got a 10p piece and a 5p piece alongside each other, that's actually quite different. And I think those moments do come. And I think the organisation then has a decision to make. And I think the leader then has a decision to make, particularly if the two coins have separated. And essentially, that's what happened to me. It's happened to me twice in my career. I'm not a complete crusader, so it doesn't happen every day. And I've been in the workplace now for 30 years since university, so it's only once every 15 years. But I think you do have to be prepared to deal with those moments when they come, be you the organisation or the individual, because both of those things, or people, the organisation as an entity and the individual as a person, have to stand for something, and that matters. Those would be sort of general comments in relation to your question, Gareth. What was the substance? Well, the substance was actually very difficult. The substance was lonely, because I was trapped in a middle ground where, with one or two notable exceptions, and they know who they are, largely speaking, nobody agreed with me. So, in very simple terms, to put it into a nutshell for your listeners, you're probably both very well aware of this, and I don't want to go over the whole thing. It's been extensively covered in numerous ways that people can look up in the media. But in simple terms, roughly halfway through the Afghanistan tour, when I was in command of 4-5 Commando and a whole bunch of other attached organisations, brilliant Gurkhas and all sorts of other terrific people, David Cameron completely unexpectedly, nobody was anticipating this, not even the Chief of Defence Staff, completely unexpectedly announced, for political reasons, I think it was a crazy thing for him to do, but I understand it politically from his perspective. He announced the withdrawal of British combat troops from Afghanistan. What that led to was a flurry of activity back in the UK at senior military levels. How do we make happen this edict that the Prime Minister has just announced in Parliament, which of course is his prerogative? And what that led to, which is not unusual, it's doctrinally accurate, as you will remember, Gareth, what that led to was the removal of headquarters as the beginning of a withdrawal, and larger numbers of people being put under the command of fewer headquarters. And so it happened to me. So this all took some weeks to make happen. And so for the last 3 weeks of a 6-month tour, I suddenly became in command of 2 units, not one. So I had my own unit, 4-5 Commando, and I had not all of it, but the vast majority of 4-2 Commando to my north, who I didn't know, hadn't force generated, hadn't led during the tour. I had those 2 units for that last 3 weeks, and it increased, I think, my command from something like 1,350 to the low 2,000s. That was roughly the implication. And it subsequently transpired that it was during that 3 weeks that Sgt Blackman, 4-2 Commando, not 4-5 Commando, had committed his atrocity. And so, although not my unit, he had done it at that moment in time beneath my command, which presented me with a massive problem, in that I could understand had Sgt Blackman been in 4-5 Commando, I would have resigned immediately on the basis of the fact that my leadership had failed. But he wasn't. And I was persuaded by the school of thought that said, you shouldn't do that because you've never met him. I haven't to this day. You've never spoken to him. I haven't to this day. You don't know him. You don't know the unit. It was a unexpected happening where suddenly for 3 weeks you just had to command 2 units, one of which was unknown to you. And I could, to a point, buy that. There was still a thing flashing in the back of my head that you have to carry your responsibilities in fair weather or foul, but I could buy broadly the logic of that argument, and so I didn't resign. But what I did do is I made it completely clear that I expected to be called to give evidence at Sgt Blackman's court-martial, because I thought there was extensive contextual evidence in terms of the manner in which he and his unit were being led that, in relative terms, increased the likelihood of a Sgt Blackman atrocity taking place. And I wanted to be able to explain that. I also felt it was a basic requirement that, as his commanding officer at the time, I would be asked, how the hell did you let this happen? This is in part on you. You're responsible. You're accountable. You're the senior person. So I found it almost inconceivable that I wouldn't be invited to give evidence and be cross-examined at the court-martial. And I was given some platitudes saying, yeah, don't worry, you will be. It's important. Of course you will be. And then it started to become apparent that what was being presented was that Sgt Blackman was a single rotten apple in the barrel, which of course is reputationally face-saving. It's all on one person, a wrong 'un, rather than my argument, which was that the barrel was putrid and therefore it was rotting its apples. And so the barrel carried some responsibility, as did the apple. And the court-martial came to an end without me having been called to give evidence, without me having had any part in it at all. It came to an evidence on Friday afternoon. It came to a close on a Friday afternoon. And Sgt Blackman was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. And I thought, okay, I've got a very big problem now here. And I resigned on the Monday morning. And I said, I will not wear uniform again. They said, well, you can't say that. You owe us a notice period. And I said, you need to understand, I will not be wearing uniform again. I'm leaving the Royal Marines at this point, and I never wore uniform again. They quite quickly decided that they were going to play ball. And 4 years later, in the Royal Courts of Justice, the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas, and his fellow law lords, Heather Hallett, who's now doing the COVID inquiry, and Lord Leveson, who you will have heard of, finally looked at this whole thing in the round and changed the verdict to manslaughter flowing from diminished responsibility on the basis of inadequate oversight, which is kind of what I'd been driving at all along. So we got there in the end, but I hope that explains the rationale behind the decision making that you asked for, Gareth.
It absolutely does, and thank you for your candour and your honesty. You talked about the analogy of a bad apple versus a bad barrel. When we did an episode earlier last year on why organisations and why people do bad things, and we used the Holocaust and the Second World War as an exploration of that, we explored the idea of bad apples, bad barrels, and bad coopers. And I think for me personally, I wasn't on that tour, and I didn't know the unit and the cultures of those units, particularly at the time. But the thing that I found difficult as a Royal Marine was the response of the Royal Marines afterward, and as you alluded to, the sort of face saving and not trying to learn lessons going forward. And I think that, for me, is the bit that I'm particularly interested in, is organisational cultures that talk about being learning organisations, empowering people to have honest, loyal dissent and talk about where things are, or challenge where they don't agree with decisions that are being made. And it felt like a moment where I thought that was the case, and then it turned out that various elements of the Royal Marines weren't, and wider defence, I think. And that, to me, is why I think your dedication to the people that you commanded and the ethos that you were standing to uphold was so important, rather than the specifics of the incident itself and the individuals concerned. It's that wider cultural learning piece that I think is so important.
I think that's right, and I'll pick up on that in two ways. I mean, firstly, the ethos point, I think, is an interesting one, because your point about, or the point we've been discussing about barrels and apples, none of that, in my opinion, exonerated Sgt Blackman. His behaviour was outrageous and shameful. I just thought there were factors to do with the barrel that increased the likelihood of that behaviour happening, which I thought was a failure on behalf of the barrel as well as Sgt Blackman. But I had no time at all for the very large groups of people who sought to enlist my help at the time, who thought that what Sgt Blackman had done was laudable and worthy of being decorated for. Nothing was further from my mind. I thought it was horrifying. And that made it a very lonely position to be in, because there was also a school of thought that said what he had done was so outrageous, blind to the factors of the barrel, that he should be locked up forever and the key thrown away. And that seemed to me to be unjust in a nation that prides itself on its criminal justice system. So I wasn't allied anywhere really. In terms of the learning point, I mean, I guess I better just answer that head on. The straight answer to it would be I agree. And I banged my head against a brick wall for 5 years trying to make sure that this learning happened and was digested into the organisational DNA in order to, none of which, of course, I had to do. I was no longer part of the organisation. I certainly wasn't being paid to do it. It just felt that important in order to, in relative terms, reduce the chance of such a thing happening again. But there was enormous resistance to it. And I say that openly, critically of the Royal Marines at that particular moment in time, which was very sad to me. But I think the Royal Marines got this wrong. And it really wanted something that was deeply, grievously, and I understand that, embarrassing and shaming to itself, really to go away. It was like a bit of an ugly family secret. And I felt that the only way that it could actually go away is if it was properly explored, properly understood, properly used as a case study and properly learnt from at all levels of training, be it new entry or indeed command training. And there was massive resistance to that because of the level of sensitivity surrounding it. And frankly, for an organisation that is supposed to be selfless, learning, morally courageous, determined, and so on and so forth, I found that to be extremely disappointing.
I think this idea of culture and organizational culture is to some degree the hidden hand in so much that happens in organizations and leadership. And I think your example is such a fascinating one because on the one hand, the implication is a significant part of the Royal Marines didn't have the right culture, and another significant part of the Royal Marines did have the right culture. And I think you talked about this. How, without being specific, how do you think that comes about? Because I think people seem very confident and comfortable telling you how great their culture is, and yet this seems to be an example where that clearly was not the case.
Well, I think there's kind of two answers to the question, and I'll resist talking about things that are, in my view, unnecessarily or unduly sensitive. My view is that in a hierarchical organisation like the Royal Marines, culture flows very significantly from leadership shadow. It's straightforward. I'm a big reader of practical leadership examples. I'm not a huge reader of theoretical management gobbledygook leadership texts, but I think they pretty much all talk about leadership shadow and the impact of the approach of a leader over the people whom they cast a shadow. And I think, this is an object lesson in precisely that. On the learning front and the culture front that underpins the appetite for learning, I think it's interesting because I think I would have said to you until this particular point in time, obviously there are frailties associated with it. Gareth will remember it was by no means perfect. I'm giving you an example of the changes I sought to make in recruit troop training. So it was by no means perfect, but I think I would have said to you that the culture of the Royal Marines is very good and pretty fit for purpose. I think I would have, I've got my commando medal up on the wall in our loo downstairs, and I know the commando qualities that are engraved on that. And I think I would have said that, much of the time, more than most organisations, the Royal Marines really does demonstrate these qualities. And I think that's a very special thing. And therefore, I'm I feel privileged and extremely happy to be a part of it, and I intend to continue to be so. I think that's roughly what my psyche or mindset would have said. I think the interesting thing about culture is what happens when the organisation is acutely stressed. And that's what happened here. The Royal Marines, the Sgt Blackman battlefield atrocity, whatever the whys and wherefores of it, was a moment at which the Royal Marines was acutely stressed. And I respect and have sympathy for that. It was a horrible moment for the Royal Marines. And I think that the Royal Marines' culture at the time wasn't as strong as one would have ideally liked it to be to withstand that stress. And so I think there was a degree of running for cover rather than tackling it head on and learning the lessons. And I think, and I will always think, it's many, many years ago now, and I'm sure much has been done since. I'm talking about at that particular point in time. And I think I will always think that that was a disappointing thing to experience and witness.
It's interesting. You talked about the fact that you weren't a supporter of Al Blackman and the things that he did, but you also were not in the camp of people that said it was all on him, bad apple, lock him up, throw away the key, and that you found yourself in this difficult middle ground. And it feels like that is an echo of some of the polarization that we see in lots of different sectors and parts of our lives. How much of that very public nature of this incident and then the very quick polarization of those people that were in the camp of this is outrageous, throw away the key, and the other side, which were he was just a soldier doing his job in a stressful situation at war, he's being blamed for something that's not his fault, and the reality that we know that is actually somewhere in the middle and far more nuanced and complex. How much of that very public polarization do you think created the stress on the Royal Marines culture to actually learn lessons?
Yeah, I know. I think it definitely did. I thought it was really ugly, and I felt very sorry for the Royal Marines and many friends of mine who were still serving at senior levels in the Royal Marines at that time. So some of whom I think did their level best in extremely difficult circumstances. People I'm still very close friends with to this day. I think that polarization was enormously unhelpful. In a funny sort of way, it slightly surprised me as well. It wasn't what I was expecting. I thought there would be a much larger school of thought that sat in the middle, that essentially said, in common with any other person in this country, this person needs to be dealt with justly, not harshly, not leniently, just as if it was you, Gareth, you, Chris, or me, you would expect to be dealt with justly. And that would require the entire story to be told, the context to be understood, and legal minds far greater than ours then to make some decisions. And I thought that's where people would have naturally alighted, but actually the opposite happened. It's exactly as you described. It polarized massively. So you had very large groups of marching people calling for Sergeant Blackman to be decorated for what he did on one hand, and then on the other hand you had the opposite of that, as you've just described, Gareth, and I won't lay it out again. And I think that did make it a very, very difficult tightrope for the Royal Marines to walk, because there wasn't much balance in the discussion. And I think that was regrettable. I mean, I'm a slight bleeding heart liberal on all these fronts anyway, so I think the world is unduly polarized. I think there is a lack of appetite to try and solve problems by thinking in a non-polarized and a more balanced way. And I've experienced that over this particular incident in the Royal Marines and in other things that I've done in my life since. And I think that's regrettable. It's a hallmark of today's world that I don't hugely enjoy, and I don't look forward to bequeathing to my children.
It's actually very difficult. Your statement about the wish that people would seek justice, the challenge we have is justice is complicated.
Yes.
Justice is hard. And if you're attempting to claim you're a bleeding liberal, then I'm going to attempt to out bleeding liberal you. I think that the frailty of us being humans is we want to feel the comfort of having a clear position. And so therefore it's very, very hard for anyone to be in the middle ground because there's so much sort of shifting sand in the middle ground.
Yeah.
And so it's much easier to say he was a hero or he was a devil. And that is less about terrible people and that is more about human beings in a difficult world trying to make sense of it.
I totally agree with that. I think that summarizes it really well. And I was fascinated by the number of people I knew really well, liked very much, viewed as highly intelligent, had considerable background, affection and respect for, who adopted enormously extreme positions over this. And it is exactly the point that you've just made, Chris.
It's a challenge. So good luck, my kids. I hope you don't mind what we've left you with, but see how that goes. But I want to go back to something which is mostly because it's my thing in this podcast to go back to conversations before. You said something which I thought was incredibly important. Every organization you go to, and I'm thinking the civilian organizations I've been in, will happily show you the posters on the wall about the culture they have in the organization. You can have debates about, is that the culture you wished you had, or is that the culture? But that's a different, separate conversation. But the thing that I have observed, and in my civilian world, I've been in multiple places where there have been some very stressful situations.
Yeah.
And I think your point that says the moment that the stress is applied, you really test your culture and your leadership in ways that you 95% of your working life, you assume it's all fine. You say, aren't we great? Aren't we a strong organization? And then the 5%, all of a sudden it goes to rats and everyone pretends they were sick that day. So turning that back, you have experienced yourself as part of 4-5 Commando, many of the things you did in country. How did you think about how to, as it were, double down on those, on getting the culture right? Because to your point, when the difficulties occur, I think what you're effectively saying is it's quite easy for the culture to slide or shift in ways you don't expect or perhaps you don't want. How did you think about that as a leader? Because you had the same challenges in your unit. Did you think about it in those terms? Did you think about it in terms that said, for example, when someone back at barracks in Plymouth commits an offence, I don't know, it's a £10 fine, but now we're on the front line and you're not wearing your protection, it's now £100 fine because I have to make the point that this matters. How did you think about managing the culture in those difficult situations?
I've been a chief executive 4 times, once in the military and 3 in the civilian domain. So 4-5 Commando and then 3 post-military ones. And I think this has applied in all 4. I think that it actually, it's almost agnostic of organisation or sector or industry or scale. I think it applies across the board. And that is the point, which basically is how solid are the structural foundations of your culture. And I think it is extremely easy to self-validate. Loads of organisations do. And in a way, the Royal Marines does on the little commando medal I was referring to. It writes the qualities associated with being a commando around the edge of the medal. And civilian organisations do this by splashing their values all over their walls. And some who've thought about it at one level below, underneath the values poster, put the behaviours that support those values. But do they really stand up when the going gets tough? Is that really the DNA of the organisation the day that it's at risk of being closed down? Is that really what's in the bloodstream of the organisation the day that the Information Commissioner's office comes and says you have transgressed in a very acute way and you're about to have to pay us a fine of £10 million? What happens at that unexpected moment in time? Because those moments will come. No organisation, even the most successful, and look at some of the most awful industrial accidents or whatever it may be, they have befallen some of the most successful organisations. So all organisations at some point will be faced with acute stress. And I think that all you can do is do everything that you can in anticipation of that moment, not knowing when it will come, to cement that culture. And there are lots of ways of doing that. You for example, and organisations never think of this. I was talking to one in London the other day. You can rehearse. The military rehearses all the time. You can actually rehearse and you can bowl in a scenario to an organisation that says, we have now been hit by this. How are we going to react? Now, some people will pay lip service to it and you say that's not good enough. You do a proper rehearsal. I think you can't have organisational values and behaviour unless they are pegged to somebody's annual appraisal. So somebody needs to have an annual appraisal that is appraised in two ways. One, on the basis of their objectives, and two, on the basis of their adherence to the organisation's desired culture, etc., etc., etc. So I think there are lots of things that you can do in anticipation of the moment critique to try and make sure that the culture is strong enough to carry you through the moment critique. I think just saying these are our values and therefore this is our culture is nowhere near good enough and won't cope with the moment critique.
I mean, this has been something that I've thought about and talked about for a long time, which is I think in the civilian world, culture is vastly underrated. And dare I say it, sometimes as a tick box that people talk about. And I think that's why the conversation from your experience in the military, but now in the civilian world, is so important, because it literally does mean success or failure. And particularly in those cases where it is at the most difficult. So I think that's very hard. Perhaps we want to bring this episode to a round. We haven't obviously got on to talk about your transition to civilian career, but I think we'll come back and talk about another episode. But Gareth, what's your... I know Gareth, by the way, everyone listening, is an inveterate notes writer. So as I'm staring into the distance, asking wistful questions, Gareth's the one actually making practical sense of all of this.
Yeah, I'm sort of struck by the similarity in conclusions that we come to talking to the really eclectic range of people. And we've recently had Dave Anderson, who, again, as a Royal Marine, but as a senior NCO, he's forming of his career as a junior NCO sniper, but comes to the same conclusions about the underlying assumptions in culture, the fact that you have to have open learning organisations that test themselves and test their ability to learn from the good and the bad, the putting people first rather than the success of the leader. And by putting people first, you create the right conditions that the leader succeeds, rather than the other way around. So I think this is just another example. And then, just to finish, you then talked about the value of rehearsing things going wrong. And we've countless times on this podcast talked about the value of stress testing through rehearsals, through prior sort of planning when the stress isn't real, when you can think about things slowly, where you can stop and discuss, so that when you are hit by a crisis, you're better prepared. And you're never going to be able to fully prepare, but you've at least done some of the intellectual heavy lifting, so that when emotion kicks in, you're in a much better state. But overall, I'm just struck once again, Oliver, by the candidness of your answers in your experience, bringing lessons to life.
There's something also I wanted to bring out, which is, this is a phrase, I don't know who said it, but they were probably quite right, which was, leadership is easy, but easy things are hard. I think I've just misquoted, but we'll go with that anyway. But I think it is really easy for people going along this path of being good leaders to read the words.
Yeah.
And actually, you could probably put it in a 12-page pamphlet. In fact, I suspect the Royal Marines probably does have a 12-page pamphlet which talks about these things. That is, people should never assume that's the end. People should assume that's the beginning, because we just heard an example there notionally when we were talking particularly about culture, is from the same background, from the same pamphlet, with the same history, notionally at a high level from the same culture, and yet you can get two very different responses. And so this idea of leadership is easy, but easy things are hard. That's hopefully what we draw out in these. And Oliver, thank you for coming and talking about this. Sometimes it's hard to pin down the difference between human being A, who follows the pamphlet, and human being B, who follows the pamphlet, and yet A seems so much more effective and successful, and B seems so much less effective. Understanding how, as a leader, I can pick up what makes you different, Oliver. And as we listen, and I'm sure other people are this, I want to be more like you. I want to be that kind of leader, whether it's inherent in me or whether it's learned. That's so hard. So maybe my takeaway is, for people striving to be better leaders, the thoughtfulness about what we do is one thing, but it's the difficult everyday application of simple things which makes the difference. But what a difference that can make.
I think that's a really good kind of double way of looking at it. The day-to-day reality, I think, is key. And I remember when I was going through young officer training, and one of our instructors basically made it clear to us that as the leader, you're being watched the whole time. And if at some point you do just one thing that lies counter to the leadership you're seeking to portray, it will undermine it very quickly indeed, and very profoundly. So it is the small things every day. There's that great quote, isn't there, that Ronnie Flanagan, the highly distinguished man who had the unenviable task of converting the RUC into the police service of Northern Ireland, and he did it brilliantly, and he had a quote above his office door which he looked at from his desk as he looked at the door, to remind him all of the time of this. And it said that every contact leaves a trace. And it wasn't anything to do with forensics, even though he was a policeman. He was reminding himself of the impact that he had on every one of his people whenever he saw or encountered or spoke to any of them. And I think that's absolutely key. The second point, going to honing your ability as a leader, Chris, I've wondered about this a lot, and I think there is a degree of arrogance in leaders where there is just an assumption that because of the level they have reached, they can magically lead at it. Whereas if you are, in the civilian organisations that I've led, it would be fanciful if my CFO wasn't a highly qualified chartered accountant who had been through all sorts of training levels in order to get there, or if the people director wasn't CIPD qualified, ditto. And I think that part of the trick of leadership is that you've got to recognise that whoever you are, you have an awful lot to learn all the time. I'm mad keen on sport. And I'm not actually hugely into the high jump. I've never done it, but I watch it dutifully when the Olympics come round. And I think one of the great things about the high jump is that when the person has won Olympic gold, so they are the best in the world in their discipline, they're going to stand on top of the podium and be given the gold medal. They keep jumping until they've knocked the bar off 3 times in pursuit of just one more centimetre. And I think that's how leaders should view pursuing being better.
Well, I think that's an excellent way of concluding this episode. And if we may be permitted to invite you back, I'd love to explore how the journey that you've been on in the Royal Marines set you up for leading in the civilian world, and what lessons you've drawn across from everything you've talked about today. And if we could get you back to talk about your second career, if you like, on another episode in the future, we would be delighted to have you back.
More than happy to do that. I've greatly enjoyed today. It's been great to see you again after quite a long time, Gareth, and a pleasure to meet you, Chris. Thank you both very much indeed.
An absolute pleasure. Well, the usual roundup now for those of you who have listened to us for the first time. Perhaps you were keen to hear Oliver talk. We have more than 100 episodes now where we delve into, frankly, all of the topics that we've discussed in this episode. So please do come back and listen to more of those episodes. Of course, you can also subscribe. Every Thursday, we have an episode dropping into your inbox where you can hear us either wittering amongst ourselves or more hopefully having some guests like Oliver who can bring new and interesting insight. We are available on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. If you want to laud us or shout at us, or perhaps more hopefully give us some thoughts on what you'd like us to talk about or where you think we've gone well or wrong. We are also available on Battling with Biz on X, and we are on Battling with Biz on Blue Sky as well. I think that completes for us for today. Oliver, again, thank you so much for joining us.
My
And we
pleasure.
look forward to speaking to you all again next time on Battling with Business.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. Cheerio.